That's red. All right, well, good afternoon, and welcome to Outgrowing Content Entities. We're here to talk about Drupal entities in core, in contrib, and how we can build our own, the benefits and strengths and risks you take on when trying to define your own custom entities. I hope you leave this session with an understanding of how they work, some of the pitfalls and things to watch out for, but also feel empowered to employ them on your own site and really just excited to extend a part of Drupal. I am Jim Vomero. I am a senior engineer at 4 Kitchens. I have over 10 years Drupal experience, and I use it as a framework for all my nerdy hobbies, from running calculations for brewing beer, to planning retro arcade projects, even to helping kids learn how to survive the zombie apocalypse at summer camps. Drupal's my go-to CMS. If you have any questions for me after this presentation, please reach out. I love talking shop and would love to keep the conversation going. I'll put my contact information at the end too. I am njim on pretty much all the social feeds, GitHub, wherever. And I work at 4 Kitchens. We build websites and apps for organizations that depend on large-scale or unconventional content. So we work with associations, publishers, enterprise-level groups, media and higher education. Some of our clients include NBC Universal, PRI, Entertainment Weekly, Society of Hospital Medicine, and then a number of universities, Yale, Stanford, NYU. I spend most of my time with Ithaca College. And we make content go. So the big question to kick this off is, what is an entity? And honestly, my answer changes based on who I am talking to. So if I can quick poll the room, just by a show of hands, who here regularly works on back-end development tickets, maybe writing PHP, MySQL, or using Drupal APIs? Okay. Who calls themselves or has roles in site development, building out views, entity types, or content types, architecture? Fairly large group. And who here does not identify as a programmer at all? All right, good to know. I will say that programming knowledge is not a prereq for this conversation. The larger topic of how to build a custom entity is a good, solid, full-day workshop. I would not do it justice. So while we'll peek at some code, and I'll give you some pointers on where to get started, there's just not enough time to show you how to do it. So let's whet your appetites and talk through, it sounds like at a higher level, how these integrate with the site and what actions you might want to take to start using them. And to talk about what is an entity, you have to go back in the Wayback Machine, Drupal 6 on the screen. I was excited. Drupal 6 was the first one that had this database abstraction layer. You didn't have to use a single type of database. And that forced us to start thinking about storing information in a consistent way. Drupal 6 sites would often have hundreds of modules, but maybe the most beloved was CCK, the content construction kit. And this allowed you to add fields to a piece of content. It doesn't sound that novel, but in the landscape of CMSs, I think Drupal was doing it best. I was super excited. It's why I usually pick Drupal for any given web project. The idea of creating fieldable content really pushed us forward, and it gave us a position where everything became a node. So our public content, a page, a landing page, a news story, that was a node, as it is today. Our content that was for media, we would often have image nodes, video nodes, a YouTube video node. If we wanted users that were fieldable, all kinds of user data, we would have a user profile node. And I've had a couple of sites where a comment node was a thing and it was attached to another comment. We abused nodes, and it became confusing. And one of the things that became clear when moving to Drupal 7 is we had to rethink the content model. And so Drupal 7 tried to clean up a lot of this by creating a generic standard class called entity. It was intentionally an abstract term, and I have a definition from the documentation. Entities in Drupals are objects that are used for persistent storage and content and configuration information. So it is generic because it's going to be what you want it to be. In Drupal 7, the nodes were entities, users, taxonomy, comments. All that's still true today, but now they're natively fieldable, so we can start to use the right tool for the job. The ability to build data models to fit your organization was a big part of this. And moving into Drupal 8, we've seen the level of abstraction go one step further. Entities are now typed objects. So we have entity interface, or content entity interface, entity change interface, entity owner interface, entity revision log interface, published interface. These allow us to apply parts of the Drupal logic to any entity, the ones in core, in contrib, or the ones we build in a consistent way. It's also important to note that there are 2 types of entities in the Drupal API. So from the entity object, there's a content entity and a configuration entity. We're by and large talking about content entities in this room, although they are kind of fuzzy where one begins and the other starts when we get into some of the topics. So let's talk core. So core and contrib has a number of entities involved, inside of it. And the truth is, with core and contrib, there are probably enough tools to build any architecture I want. Drupal has a number of extensibility features that you can take a node and make it do what you want it to do. That's good to note. Most projects can be accomplished with the basic entity types. So in core, we have content, which is the node entity used for our regular pages. Custom block for ancillary content items. Media type for images, video, things of that nature. You'll also notice that some of these have a bundle, but some of them don't. And so that's just one of the words to get through as we're talking about this. Bundles are, I thought I had a real definition here, but they are variations of an entity that are going to have unique properties. So a property can be true for all, in this case, let's look at the node entity, all nodes. All nodes are going to have a sticky value, a promoted value, an author, a published date. But the individual bundles can have their own field definitions. And so when you opt something in to an entity and you're building your own, you have to decide, am I doing this because I want a property to set across all bundles or just one, or do I want that to be individual? You can also make the choice, is my entity going to be bundleable or not? Users are an example where does not have bundles. There's one type of user. If you change a setting on users, it's true for every instance of a user. Contrib entities, keep going. I think everything on the screen I use regularly. So paragraphs, as we talk about our component design, are closely mirror our model. So the paragraph entity mirrors our visual tools. Web forms actually contains 3 entities. The web form itself is an entity. It defines a type of storage. The submission is its own type of entity, and web form options is a third type of entity in that project. Path autos for patterns, meta tags for associating metadata with a page, actually for the default values. Redirects and groups is one I do enjoy. The group module creates 2 types of entities as well for storing content in relationships. So the group is one type of entity and the relationship is another. I bring these all up because I use them regularly and I've learned from them. So since I know how these work in theory, I was able to open up and look exactly at the entity definition and start to understand when I build my own entities, what can I mirror from our other providers that we're already taking advantage of. And between core and contrib, there are a lot of entities, so why even create our own? Kind of philosophical question for me. There's a lot of reasons on the screen, and we're going to talk through probably 8 examples of use cases, business use cases for a custom entity. But with that, one is probably not enough. So I have some examples to show this motivation. In practice, I would want a project to have multiple reasons before building a custom entity and going down that path. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why that would be the case or not. Let's do it. Case number 1. This is my go-to case. Called it reducing overhead, when content types are too big. So custom entities can reduce overhead. This is my go-to case for building a custom entity when just a node is too big for a job. And I want to consider the user's story. As a publisher, I'd like to add reusable callouts and cards to an ancillary content area. I want to put something in the sidebar. I want that thing to be reusable. This is going to act very different from a normal node. So a node is going to, by default, probably have a publicly viewable path. It's going to have a number of properties of revisioning information, authorship. It's going to have third-party module settings that apply to it, maybe metadata from the meta tags, XML sitemap indexing rules that we just don't care about. That's a lot of overhead on something that's a small, discrete chunk of content that could be lightweight, but isn't because we've used a node. So depending on your architecture, these reusable pieces of content in this example could be paragraphs. They also could be the content custom blocks. So that's core and contrib variations. But I want to kick the tires and see what we can do. So for a traditional Drupal 7 site, I might have created one called a person spotlight, another one called an infographic, and a third being a news item. And then each one of these would have different properties that were similar between them. So as I created the first content type, I might have added an image, a title, a subheading, and a piece of text, and a link button. And then I create the second entity, and I create those again. I create the third entity, I create most of those again. There's a lot of redundancy in this. As we see, while each one of these examples on the screen is unique, they're very related in their storage, And even in their display, they might be using a different template, but they're probably pulling contextual values from what page am I on, rendering data. So there is a set of rules that we can define that are way more lightweight than overriding how a node works to get it to look like this. And then just finally, pet peeve of mine, when everything becomes a node, you have all the node views. So you have to make sure it's excluded from search results. Make sure it's excluded from all the things. Rabbit Hole's a great project for doing that. I use it often. But I just don't want that to even be possible. So I'll take the view node view away because of my custom entity. I don't need it. And then I don't have to worry about this thing trying to render at a full screen or coming up with fictitious styles just for editorial reasons. Also in this idea of nodes being too big, this is a pet project of mine. It's on reducing overhead. So in this theory, that's not my setup, but I'm using Raspberry Pis in my home brewing beer process. And I have the Raspberry Pi taking some temperature settings and sending it over a web service, and Drupal is consuming that data and saving it. If this was a node, there is a lot of overhead involved. So once a minute, a new temperature reading comes in, and I have just a timestamp, a temperature reading, and it saves what batch beer I'm working on. All this data saves in Drupal. I could do this with a custom table and just write my own table for it and query off of that as needed. But I want to use all the features in Drupal. I want to be able to create views. I want to be able to add custom permissions and access rules. I want to be able to export this data using somebody else's views exporter module. I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. So by making it an entity, I'm able to take this data in a lightweight way. It does not need to be a node and all the overhead that comes with it, store it in my database through the API, and retrieve it faster and in a very consistent and predictable way. So small data. Question?
Any rough benchmarks on the difference in speed between entities and node access?
I wish I had those numbers. I tried to benchmark it, but I do not have a good local environment set up to do that. I plan to blog on that in the coming months once I get some good numbers. I think access rules are going to slow you down way more than the schema changes. So schema ends up going through a lot of caching, but there's a lot of node access modules that will just tank the performance of your website. And so if you're using a node and you're applying a lot of access rules to block people from seeing it, you could actually slow down every part of your website. I've seen that for sure, but I don't have the benchmarks. I'm glad you asked. And I am plowing through this fast, so my apologies. Feel free to wave me down. Second use case. Second, reason 2, optimizing. When content types are too small. Let's do the opposite end of this conversation. So this is a company I own in the greater Philadelphia area. We run summer camps. It's a lot of fun. Zombie Survival Camp's been a big hit. And Jedi Academy has been nice. And Rebel Girls Adventure has been one of our newer offerings. We do outdoor fun. And I want to pretend that I was so successful and making tons of money. I'm not. That I was going to franchise this. And so now I have an instance of this website at different regional areas. This might be true for a corporation that has multiple offices, or just any site that has some sort of a landing page that has recurring content. Each one of those pages is going to have its own local navigation, and I want to enforce rules behind it so that the first page in that local navigation needs to be about the staff at that camp. The second page needs to be probably a views-generated list of events that are upcoming. The third page could be information about birthday party packages that only that location have, or suggestions of other follow-up activities after going to, say, one of our science camps. Some of this content I want to enforce in these microsites. Some of it's optional, because every franchisee might want to add their own twist to their local area. Maybe some are go-getters with digital media, some aren't. If I was going to use nodes or a collection of nodes, this can get overwhelming. I could create one node that has all of my regional metadata associated with it. But at this point, I'm stuck in a loop where I've created a node. I want people to see content at that URL, but not all the content, because I have data that's going to drive a whole menu, a whole routing structure. This microsite's going to have many pages. I'm also in a point where I want to be able to create a microsite that has its own navigation, give the regional rep access to change some things and not all of them. And I've only achieved this in the past by creating lots of custom validation, enforcing things by setting or unsetting rules, maybe in a node access module. By getting away from using nodes and just accepting that this content is a unique beast. It's a collection of data that powers a whole microsite. By using a custom entity, I can write those rules from the ground up the way I want to see them. I don't need to fight what's in the node module. Number 3, Presenting customized editorial experiences. So in this case, we are looking at a time card system that I use for my summer camp staff. A time card has a complicated workflow and editorial experience, so that a staff member can submit their own time card, but they don't have access to all of the fields. A manager can approve hours, ask questions, and approve receipts, but not submit it to purchasing. Purchasing gets emails when the card's ready for approval, not purchasing, finance. And they could request changes, and they could also fill out some of the fields, like if we need to give someone a pay raise because they had a really rough week. It was super hot at summer camp, and they earned a bonus. Only our finance office can do that. This creates a custom workflow where if I was going to recreate this with nodes, I am probably altering the node add and edit forms and having lots of conditional visibility settings. Lots of field-based access rules that change. In the beginning, you might have access to a field, but once the time card's approved, you no longer have access to that. And I can't use publishing settings because, well, I don't want this ever published to the world. So I either need to set up workflows and custom accesses, or just accept that the normal workflows are not big enough for this use case, and I can create something probably pretty lean and custom, a small workflow to manage this. One other thing, as far as access goes, and that's hinting at the next one, for a time card, I never want to delete one of these. If a change is made, a revision is logged, and no one, not even user one, can delete a revision on a time card for auditing and finance purposes. So that's another area where I would have to fight the default entities because they want to be revisionable and changeable and malleable. Number 4, access. So defining custom access controls is what I was getting at. Years ago, I spent most of my career at Penn State as a developer there, and I worked on a ticketing system for their media group. Issues came in through the website, through a help desk, or through faculty requests, and there were multiple different issue types. Each issue type had its own workflow. A ticket expediter would have access to a number of fields before the ticket was processed. As the ticket moved through the workflow, other folks would gain access. So as somebody in the tech lab group, I might be able to fill out all of the tech lab related tickets, all of the fields, but I have very little say over a purchasing ticket. I can weigh in on it, leave some comments, I can see them, I can access very little of it. Same user, same role, different tickets, so access control by maybe taxonomy. There's a project for that that's popular. As a support manager, I might have access to all of the tickets, but nothing's ever assigned to me. In fact, when I log in, I only see high-level reports of what's going on. Now we have access by role, but it's independent of the taxonomy. Also valid. As the person who submitted the ticket, I have an account on the system, because it's through a single sign-on provider, but I can only fill out some of the fields once. Once this enters the workflow, I no longer have the ability to change all of them, unless it moves back through the workflow again. So we have field-based access based on the workflow state. And the last example was there was a reporting and analytics group that would want to read access to all the tickets to generate reports for the higher up on how the help desk was doing. That group could read a lot of data, they couldn't change anything. When you get into multiple permission schemes, it just makes sense to define your own access rules. And so that's a built-in feature defining custom entity. You will end up writing a custom access control handler. Next up, number 5 of 7. Reusing content field definitions through bundles. So I've worked on a few tech conferences over the years, and custom entities are a win for me. In the idea of an event, if there's an event, just like here today, there might be a session, a keynote that is for a larger group, a workshop that in this case we're going to say is a paid event that you have to register for, a social activity where we're going to get drink tickets based on your registration, so that's on there too, but it's for everybody, there's no track. And then the BOF, which is maybe a little more ad hoc, so we don't have all of the information. There's not going to be an image. Some of these might surface organically. Each one of these I could define as its own node. I could also create one node to rule them all, but they do have different field needs. They will all have different displays. The keynote's going to be highly stylized, where the social event probably will look more like a banner ad somewhere else, and the BOF will probably have more of a secondary look on a page. So they're going to look different. They're going to have different fields. It's starting to sound like this is a good case for custom entities, and in this case, custom entities with bundles. So this is leveraging bundles where I can decide that my base conference event entity has a title, a location, a time slot, and a description always. That is always the case. And then on a per bundle basis, I can add additional fields. Just like in Node, you always get a title and sticky, and you could hide some of them, but they're always there. And then you can add additional fields per content type, In this one, I'll add additional fields per conference event type. And so I might add an image, a track banner image for a secondary image for the keynote, because we're promoting them. Registration links are added on a per bundle basis. This is nice. We could do this once again with nodes. With nodes, if I needed to add a 6th category, I need to redefine all those fields. With this custom entity, I already get the first 4 out of the box. So that's kind of nice. Any rules that govern one will govern all of these. And maybe more importantly, won't govern the other nodes. So if this is my content architecture and I'm using nodes, and I add just a page content type, that has very different rules, or a web form that has very different rules than the rest of these. And so I like to keep those kinds of things separate if it truly is intrinsic to the data model. Last one. Oh, no, 2 to go. When performance is a highly valued goal. I have the most generic slide on for this one because I wasn't sure how programmer friendly this would be. So I apologize if you lose me. But I have 2 points on this. The first was access controls slow down sites, and that's what I was mentioning before. There's access control modules that, when views picks up, will start to kill caching of results. So if you need custom access rules, it really helps to define that at the entity level, rather than turning on a field access control module and only leveraging it in a little way. So just be conscientious, benchmark your things. It matters a lot more when people are logging into a site. Public content has other caching mechanisms. So a lot of this performance stuff is only about requests going back to origin. But the second one, normalized versus denormalized databases. Drupal, when it went through its database abstraction exercise, did a great job of normalizing all the things. So when you add an entity type, and we'll think node, you get the node table, and then the node data table. And let's say it's revisionable, as nodes usually are. You're also going to get a revision table, and then the node revision data table. So 4 tables just to exist. And then every field you add is going to have a table for that field value and a table for the revision. So if you have 30 fields, we're talking over 60 tables just for that without any data in it. That's a large schema, but it's not obscene, especially if you're reusing fields across your website. But if you are in a case where you're doing a lot of direct queries against something very predictable, it's sometimes nice to have it all just in one selectable table. And so by defining your own custom entities, you can use base fields to denormalize all the things. Also very useful for transaction purposes, but if you don't know what I'm talking about, let's just move on. Just know that you have the option to decide if your custom entities are normalized versus denormalized in their storage. And this one, I got nothing. I haven't tried it. Case number 7, I'm super interested. Using non-standard storage for moderated data. The internal SQL database interface is the default for where all our storage mechanisms come from. There's also a few entity types that use a no storage interface, but that's about it for popular projects. There's nothing stopping you from storing your data in a JSON file or having your data come through a custom feed. So this project here, external entities, very interesting one. There's some examples of, say, having data that pulls in from Wikipedia on your page and looking like it's first-party source. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you might have your own third-party integrations. And you could say, hey, this custom entity is actually stored in this database in this way by defining your own storage handler. All right. Whew. Are you excited? I went fast, so yes, this is a good break time. I'm not done.
Are there any modules that are working now where you can do a view against like a JSON API?
I don't know. I haven't had that need, but we use migrations so much for our incoming feed data that it becomes a first-class entity, and then you can do a view against it. I imagine, though, that if you had a custom entity that was pointed to a JSON API, you can do a view against entities, so views will just natively do it if you had a custom entity pointed to it.
So just abstract through the entity?
Correct. So there is a storage handler for every entity, and you could set that to something other than MySQL storage, and you can make it a feed. I've just described a highly technical process that I didn't even want to talk about on the slide because I've never done it. I keep it pretty traditional. Any other questions before I dive into the more technical parts? All right. I hope you feel excited. I hope you feel empowered, as you do after lunch. You're all eager, I can tell. I hope you're feeling ready to create some custom entities. And with that, I got to warn you, okay? This is not a thing to dive headfirst on. Experiment. Make your mistakes somewhere else. Because I've only listed 4, but I do have some real sobering advice when going down this route. There is a steep learning curve when compared to other Drupal APIs. It's not unobtainable. It's just you're not going to find 1,000 tutorials like you would on, say, building a custom block or a plugin. So there's a little bit more. In fact, you will find yourself working in the API and reading the documentation and the code more often than not to truly understand what all the parameters are. The second is it's less likely contrib modules will work with your custom entity. That was a fear of mine 3 years ago when I would have a module called automatic node titles and it worked for nodes. But over time, that became, I think there's an automatic entity title. So a lot of the modules node queue became entity queue. A lot of the modules that were just for nodes, node clone, have since been rewritten at the more abstract level of entity. But I'm still putting that caveat. It is less likely that if someone comes up with a really cool project, it's less likely it's going to work for your entity, but you know it's going to work for a node because that's how everyone tests their data against. So caveat to keep in mind. Number 3, custom entities may not inherit future Drupal features. And I got bit with this. I want to say in the 7.4 to 7.5, somewhere around there, some revisioning interfaces on nodes were updated. A better system came out. The old one was deprecated. The new one came in for nodes. My custom entities did not have them until I applied it. And so I had to figure out how the interface worked. It was not an automatic win that I had the more performative system with the Drupal core update. And so with that, that's actually a good segue to number 4. You are responsible for maintaining any of this custom code. There is a lot of boilerplate. It takes some time to understand what it's doing. And so there's a potential for technical debt. I would just be cautious there. With that, I don't know, live dangerously. Have a little fun on your personal sites. I have 2 demos, and let's see how we're doing on time here. And I want to talk about building custom entities with ECK, that is a web interface for our site builders, and generating entities with Drupal console, Lando for a lot of our local development environments. And so if you see the Lando command, you can ignore it if it's not something you're familiar with or used to working with. But we are going to use Drupal console. That is a talk on its own. It's a wonderful tool that's taught me a lot about the inner workings of Drupal because it will build the boilerplate you need to define things like custom entities. Very first thing, though, I have my site here, and I would like to create a module to store this. If I have custom code, I need to store it. It's going in a module. We're going to make a module for putting puns in the secondary area. It's called Joking Aside. You get it? Yeah, I know. And the description defines an entity and tools for managing jokes that my coworkers are sick of. So without needing to know too much about it, let's just try making this module. Give it a moment. It is going to be at this point, I just want the .info file. And presentation tools are taking a while, of course. Go. But this is going to be where we store our custom entity. Drupal console does have some great definitions, documentation on how these different commands work. There we go. So, I made the module file. Didn't want it. I don't want most of the things. No dependencies. We're just keeping this lightweight for now. No unit tests. No templates. Yes, proceed with the operation. So it created 2 files, a .info and a .module in a folder. And hopefully, darn, I got to get out of presentation mode. I'm going to do my best here.
It's in their view.
Thank you. That's not the important one to me anyhow. Yeah. New module. And it should appear now in customs. It's called Joking Aside. It has the .info and mostly empty .module. I think there's some help text in there by default. Good practice. And so the last piece we need to do is create the new entity using Drupal console. And that is Lando Drupal generate entity content. There's also a generate entity config. That was the other flavor that is not useful to us today. We're going to generate this new entity called a pun. But there's a lot of supporting documentation that goes with it. So there's the entity definition itself, which is defined through an annotation. We'll look at those. But there's also all the things that allow the Drupal interface to see that entity. You can delete those after this is done generating them. So the idea of having a form that shows all your entities, that's something that you're responsible for now. Luckily, Drupal console gives you that by default. You can delete it if you want. A button that says add a new instance of the entity, so add a new pun. That is something you can add or remove, pick or choose. It's going to create a bunch of files for us. So I do want an admin structure. I'm not going to give this one bundles. I'm going to say a pun is a pun. And I'm going to turn off a lot of things just so the screen isn't overwhelming at the first one we create. Because it did create 15 different files for it. The entity itself is the important part. The other ones help support it, but are not necessarily needed, especially if you want to inherit an interface that already exists in Drupal as is. This is boilerplate for you to override it if that floats your boat. Cool. I'm going to just rely on zooming. So our custom module, in here, in source, entity, we see I have two things worth checking out. First is the pun entity. So here's the new one. It has this @content entity type declaration at the top. This is part of Drupal's discovery mechanism that's going to find all of these and do whatever it needs to. So in this case, build out your storage, update access rules if it's required. When it finds all these entities, it's going to parse it and do the things it does through the entity API. Looking down this list, okay, just checking it on time. Looking down this list, there's a number of properties that are fairly straightforward. It has an ID of pun, just like an ID of node, and a label of pun. In Drupal, we'd have a label of content. And then the bundles themselves would be called content types. The handlers is really the meat of it, where we're going to be affecting the things I described in those 7 examples. So the ones that are probably the most interesting. Forms. This one has a default form, and actually it looks like it's using the same one for the add and the edit, and then a separate form for delete. This is your opportunity to say, I would like my entity add form to look one way, using a Drupal forms code. I would like my entity edit form to look a different way. And there's a number of these that have been standardized, these keys. So you might see a delete multiple, and there is the ability to start defining your own forms. But it's nice that it gave us one to start. So in this case, just like our node type, add and edit are using the same one. And since Drupal console generated, here's our code. And literally the only thing it's doing is using the defaults from entity form and then saving it. So here's an opportunity to say, I don't want the defaults, I can delete this line, or I probably do want the defaults and I will override some things. So right in this method now, Drupal console has given us the ability to put whatever we like in there. And if we have time, I'll show you an example of, say, Node and some other ones, so you can see what they've done with their custom forms and handlers. So those are the forms. The default one will get any requests that don't have a key associated with it, but then you can get granular as you move through this. The access control handler is where a lot of your permission rules are set. This is looking at CRUD operations, so it's not individual Drupal permissions. It's when someone wants to read this entity, view it, do they have rules? And there's a lot that go into that. It's not just a permission or a role or are you signed in or not. It's a combination of all those things come together for access control rules. We could take a peek at that yet because it created a handler for us. The root provider, this has all the route settings that you would expect for a new entity, so adding one. In nodes, for example, there is a node add form, there is a node there's an add node type form, there is a delete node type form, so all of these routes got to be defined somewhere. They match up to things like our forms, but we have the ability to control where and when they go. We're not going to just make the assumption that everyone needs the same interfaces for all your custom entities. Base tables, and some of these are for MySQL storage. Entity keys, that's a storage thing. Admin permission, this is a permission it gives you out of the box. You get one for folks who are going to get opted into all the things entity related. And links, these are templates. These are more useful than anything else. By me putting this template here, that say my new pun will be publicly visible at admin structure pun and then the pun ID. So just like node/1, this one is admin structure pun. I might not like that. I might want it at pun/25. So this is an opportunity to say, no, I want it somewhere public, and I'm going to use it, and it's a glossary of all the things that annoy my family. Likewise, in add form, you control where you add, where you edit, where you delete. The collection is the list of content. So in nodes, you have admin/content for all your nodes. And this is actually a good point for me to mention that every entity is different. And so by creating a custom entity, you have now defined something that does not fit the node model. So if you were going to the admin/content, your entity is not going to appear there. That shouldn't be too shocking because right now you couldn't create a view that had both users and taxonomy terms reported. You could do some joins through contextual filters and show relationships of data, but you can never create a view that's going to have multiple entities all reporting the same way. So you are siloing your content. Sometimes that's a strength, sometimes it's a weakness. Keep that in mind if you go custom entity route. And then this is just a nice, there's a couple of them in here that are nice gimmes. So field UI base route, And let's see if I have any other ones worth picking on. There's just a couple of annotations you can throw in here that give you automatic wins. So by using the field UI, you're going to get the manage fields, manage displays, manage forms interface that you expect for content types. You don't have to have that, though. If you're on a headless Drupal site and this is just for data storage, you can get rid of all of that. Outside of that, the rest of this pun definition is mostly inheriting from its parent, or it's doing getters and setters for all the field values. You're responsible for that, and you can decide that when somebody gets the owner, you don't just report the owner name, you're going to do a directory lookup and return some sort of object. That's up to you. Base field definitions. This is where I was talking about controlling how things are stored in the database as well. You have full control over the schema. You wouldn't have had that on nodes. You can decide that you don't want all of the fields that normally come with nodes, or you do want, for that case of the event, I want to find multiple base fields that are always in existence for this entity. This is where they're defined. So in this case, there's one called name, and that's analogous to the title for a content node. While it looks long, a lot of that is getters and setters or boilerplate that you're going to see on any entity. In fact, if you were to take this annotation at custom entity type and just search over the course of a Drupal project, you're going to see all the other ones that exist. So just to read them out loud, content, media, state interface, entity shortcut. So this is an example of where you can dive in and just see how others are using this interface or not using parts of it to find their entities. You'll learn a ton from that. The other files that came through this that are pretty interesting, the menu link actions and tasks. These are the links that appear on different parts of your interface. And I might as well tell it to look. So the settings where you could, for nodes, this is where you can say nodes are revisionable or not. Or the collection where you see a list of the all nodes, in this case all puns. It's generating these links for you. You can decide you don't want them. You can decide you want them in a different way. But Drupal console is a nice tool for generating all this boilerplate. Let me try enabling it, but while that's happening, let's see if I got Drush on here. And do we just call it? No, we called it joking aside. So we can see this in action. It's actually pretty anticlimactic to see because it's going to look just like all your other interfaces, and that's the point. Refresh. And so now under structure, we have a pun settings page, the pun canonical collection list. We can move these links by editing those action routes or those link routes. That's all definitions we have the ability to take over. We also have the pun type itself, which I am guessing through the pun list I can definitely get to it because I saw there was an action button, add a new pun. Since this is pretty empty, I have just a few settings that it gave us out of the box by using things like the revisional fields, or I guess the publishing interface. So I can name it, and that's it. At this point, I can add fields to it with the field API. Just like you add fields to a content type, we can now add fields to a pun. And here we go. So you can create your own fields for this, or you could have identified your fields through that base definition table in the pun entity file. Other than that, it's worth just poking around. There's some things. How does views data integrate? It gets certain properties from its parents, but you can determine your own. If you want to have new fields or filters available in your views for your entities, here's the place to do it. Access control handler, this is those CRUD operations as mapped to Drupal. So what determines if someone can view, update, or delete this? It's up to you. And the route provider. For the most part, this is just calling through to its parent. So let's take a peek at what its parent does. And the different routes that are associated with this. So these are the pages in Drupal associated with your entity. The add page to add a new instance of the entity. The add form, I might have these backwards, to add a new entity type if that's useful to your entity. The canonical route to view your entity. So some of this is just jargon, and once you learn what those are, you realize you have full control over what you want your entity to do, because you don't have to opt in any of these, or how you want it to work. The last thing I wanted to show off was the ECK module. This is the entity construction kit. When you enable it, you get this page, and this works exactly like defining a content type. I can add a custom entity, and it's going to ask me a label. what's I don't know, aside for sidebar items. I keep going to that case of just little things in the sidebar. So we're creating a new entity called aside, and you can define if you do want some of these fields or don't. We'll give it a title field because it feels like that would be important. These are your base field settings. After that, you are just using the field API. So because you're using this interface, you do not have all the options I described. You're going to have the ability to silo your content through ECK, but you won't have the functions of doing all the custom control handlers, doing all of the route changes. All of the things that I showed in there, you're back to overriding an existing system, which is sometimes the light touch you need, but other times can be very aggressive. So we created a new entity type. You can add bundles. You can add new items. You can delete it. It works exactly like defining a new content type. Since almost everyone raised their hand, I'm not going to show off how to do it. And so with that, I think, nope, that's not it. Building custom entities. Do you guys have any questions? Did I exhaust it? Is anyone excited to try custom entities on their sites? Does anyone mind sharing the use case that they see?
So
What do you got?
We run a marketplace for a university, and we have all these different types of items. So they can all be displayed differently. Who gets to view them based on role? I see millions of use cases already. And that's how we sort of structured our websites based on content types.
Yeah. And the role-based thing was an eye-opener for me because typically in Drupal, I'm thinking about permissions and roles in a very concrete way.
Oh, the forms as well.
Sure. And the fields on those forms, you would have the
some
ability.
users to see certain fields and edit certain fields, while other users shouldn't have that permission.
By having the ability to define your own access control handler, and we saw it on the screen temporarily with just the view, edit, delete permissions, you can open up to all kinds of ideas because you're in full control. Access at just different times of the day is possible. I don't know why you would want to do it, but you could. So that sounds exciting. Good luck to that one. That sounds like a perfect use case. Anything else come to anyone's mind?
Have you run into any issues with caching and cache tags?
Yes. So there is a node and a node list cache tag that is 100% predictable. As you get into defining your own bundles, you may have to declare those cache tags somewhere else.
Okay.
So I have not seen a predictable way to get all of the cache tags that Node has defined for itself. Although I've run into the same issue, say, with other entities that aren't nodes. So user data, if I was trying to surface that with cache tags, I don't have all of the tags I would like.
Okay.
Onus is on you to do it now.
Cool. Thanks.
Anything else? All right. Well, thank you so much. I powered through it, and I really appreciate you coming today.